Welcome to Jean's Sermon Series. Today's sermon is titled Moral Foundations. I delivered this sermon originally at the Unitarian Church, and it's a kind of a hybrid genre partaking in their This I Believe tradition, but it's also partly a book review. And this is the book, Justice for Hedgehogs by my hero, Ronald Dworkin. Let me read to you from Ronald Dworkin's work. This book defends a large and old philosophical thesis, the unity of value. Its title refers to a line by an ancient Greek poet, Archilochus, that Isaiah Berlin made famous for us. The fox knows many things. The hedgehog knows one big thing. Value is one big thing. The truth about living well and being good and what is wonderful is not only coherent but mutually supporting. What we think about any one of these must stand up eventually to any argument we find compelling about the rest. I try to illustrate the unity of at least ethical and moral values. I describe a theory of what living well is like, and what, if we want to live well, we must do for, and not do to, other people. That idea, that ethical and moral values depend on one another, is a creed. It proposes a way to live. But it is also a large and complex philosophical theory. Intellectual responsibility about value is itself an important value. My overall thesis is unpopular now. The fox has ruled the roost in academic and literary philosophy for many decades. Hedgehogs seem naive or charlatans, perhaps even dangerous. In a following chapter, Dworkin lays out sort of a foxy view in quite a generous way, a way that shows how persuasive it can be, and then contrast it to what he calls the ordinary view. If some value judgments are true and others false, how can we human beings discover which are which? Even friends disagree about what is right and wrong. And of course we disagree even more strikingly with people of other cultures and ages. How can we think, without appalling arrogance, that we are right and others are just wrong? From what neutral perspective could the truth finally be tested and settled? Someone who sticks pins into babies for the fun of hearing them scream is morally depraved. Don't you agree? You probably hold other, more controversial opinions about right and wrong as well. Perhaps you think that torturing suspected terrorists is morally wrong, for instance. Or, on the contrary, that it is morally justified, or even required. You think that your opinions on these matters report the truth, and that those who disagree with you are making a mistake. So, I was inspired to want to give this sermon in the first place by a previous sermon at the Unitarian Church, where the lay reader asked whether justice exists. And I want to address a question that's intimately related but not identical. Is there such a thing as an objective answer to a moral question? So I have spent beginning in adolescence, I spent about 25 years of my life fretting over this question more or less intensively, starting in about 10th grade when I had a mini nervous breakdown. Not just over that question. There was other stuff going on in my life at the same time. But certainly one part of the anguish was this kind of paralyzing philosophical uncertainty. Everything seemed so complicated the more I learned about the world. And I was in extreme doubt that I could ever figure out the truth about anything, including what kind of person I ought to be or how I ought to live. And let me assure you that I'm fine now. I'm in pretty good shape. I had a rocky and lengthy adolescence, but now I'm fine. Late bloomer. So, can moral questions ever be answered objectively? Per the central metaphor of Dworkin's book, people who answer this question yes are the hedgehogs, and people who don't answer it yet, for whatever variety of reasons, either because they think moral judgment is supposedly all relative to the individual psychology, or the collective culture, or some blend of those two, or because all opinion of all kinds is just subjective, whatever. Those are Dworkin's foxes. And you can see there are certain connotations to those animal tropes, kind of Aesop's fable stuff. Foxes are smart, adaptable to a wide variety of situations, maybe a little crafty. Foxes are hunters sometimes, and other times they have to evade people who are hunting them. So they take on different roles according to circumstance. Foxes are sophisticated, where hedgehogs are simple, sturdy little things, maybe a little prickly. They dig into a defensive posture and they stay there. They know one thing. So no wonder foxes feel superior. Some foxes are so sophisticated that addressing the fundamental question, is objective moral reasoning possible, they won't even answer the question no. That would put them on the same level as the hedgehog, right? Just on the opposite side. Instead, they say the question is a mistake. Like you might reject a question like, do unicorns have cloven hooves? Or, is the Easter Bunny a heterosexual? Or questions refer to entities whose existence is at best conjectural, if not pure fantasy. There are these questions that can't be answered on the basis of empirical evidence. So if you ask them, intending them sincerely as some kind of scientific inquiry, you're betraying your fundamental misunderstanding of the world. So say foxes. Your questions aren't grounded in anything outside of just language. They have no foundation. So another way of rephrasing my thesis question about moral foundations might be, are the words should and justice, are they really any different from the word unicorn? You know, just a pretty story that some people made up and like to talk about. So metaphysical conversations can get abstract very fast, and I want to put two concrete examples on the table. These are not intended to be especially controversial examples, at least these days, and at least in our neck of the woods. Example 1, homosexuality. Some people think, still there are some who think, that homosexual acts are an abomination, and absolutely, therefore, we should have legal and social sanctions against them. Maybe not stoning to death, although it has been mentioned historically. Other people think homosexual acts raise no moral issues that aren't also raised by equivalent heterosexual acts, and the two orientations, therefore, should absolutely be on a legal par. So, okay, I realize I'm leaving out some area here in the middle of the spectrum, in between abomination and perfectly fine. There's room for people to find themselves somewhere in between those two extremes on the spectrum of attitudes. Example number 2, honor killing. Some people think that it is a moral obligation to execute girls and women who have been sexually defiled according to community standards, that this redress is necessary to expunge the insult to the family. And other people rate this practice an abomination. On this spectrum of opinion, I think that you would not find so many people anywhere in the middle of it. I think that, on the contrary, we would have a bimodal distribution where most people are crowded into one end. Honor killing. You either love it or hate it. Now I have a view on both of these issues. And because I'm a hedgehog, I think my view is actually the correct view. According to me, Jean, homosexuality is not an abomination. It is, in fact, perfectly fine. But I haven't always felt sure it was perfectly fine, and I spent several years contemplating this issue, starting roughly in the 10th grade, which was for me in the 1970s. In the 10th grade, I was in a sex education class. They didn't call it that, they called it health ed or something, but sex education is what it was. And there was a textbook, And in that textbook, among other things, it said that homosexuals were generally immature individuals and a little screwed up. Maybe not vile sinners deserving death, but not exactly all the way okay and happy. So I didn't believe this altogether. I didn't swallow it whole anyway. I was a little bit skeptical about it. But it was in the textbook, and I was a good student. I was used to assimilating what the books told me, and therefore it made me somewhat uneasy. I was skeptical about the textbook, but I was also, by then, skeptical about my own feelings. And I could recognize, as a matter of fact, that I was immature and a little screwed up and unhappy. So it was possible that the author was right, that homosexuality didn't deserve the same amount of respect as regular sexuality. And that inner reservation stayed in my mind for several years after. It was still in my mind every time I sneaked into Antigone Books downtown and bought myself a lesbian romance novel. One day in the 1980s, I was reading quite a different kind of book, an eco-fantasy novel where the main character was a whale. This whale was alone for some reason. I've forgotten the details. I think maybe whalers had killed all of her close companions and she was the only one that escaped. She was looking for other whales, and she ran into another lone whale, also female, but it wasn't the same species as her, and it wasn't traveling in the same direction as her, so it wasn't going to solve her long-term companionship problem. But the two animals did stop and nuzzle together for a while before they separated. And among other cuddling, one whale stroked the other whale's sexual organs with her fin. So I was engaged in this scene. I'm totally rooting for the whales. And I noticed as I was reading that the little uh-oh, or mental reservation, that I always felt when I was reading a human sex scene in one of the lesbian romance novels, the uh-oh wasn't there for the whales. And so I stopped and questioned myself, why no mental reservation? The debate didn't last a very long time because it just seemed to me ridiculous that anybody would bother to have much of a moral reaction to what a couple of whales were doing down at the bottom of the ocean. And not only that it ought to be morally irrelevant, but that it would be warped morally, even, that somebody might begrudge these two lonely animals whatever physical comfort they could take from each other. And as I came to that conclusion, which really seemed obvious to me, there was like a turning and click in my head, like when you reach the last number on a combination lock. Oh, wait, I'm an animal too. So the moral conclusion I have just reached with respect to these two whales also should apply to me. It was like the heavens opened up. I could hear angel choirs singing, and my mental reservation and moral uncertainty after that was banished completely, at least on that topic. I felt perfectly free in moral terms at that point to pursue relationships with women. That didn't mean I wanted to rush home and brag to my parents about my epiphany, but that was because I thought there might be something wrong with their thinking, not because there was something wrong with mine on this subject. Now, in our time and place, the attitude I've just described is no longer very controversial. It's delightful, isn't it, to see how everybody is suddenly crowding down to this end of the spectrum? Most liberally educated people, most practitioners of multiculturalism, valuers of diversity, philosophical pragmatists, whatever, all sorts of foxes, they have extremely little sympathy left for those who cling to the concept of homosexuality as an abomination. I chose that extreme word on purpose because I think it's revealing. Words like sin and abomination don't sit comfortably in a modern person's vocabulary, much less a postmodern person. Most of the people that say abomination, not meaning it ironically, tend to be religious literalists. which kind of makes them hedgehogs. My brethren, sort of. Like me, they believe that right is right and wrong is wrong. It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Well, there's more than one way to be a hedgehog. Let's compare. Take the question, is homosexuality an abomination? Like any fundamentalist, I think this question has a correct answer. But unlike a fundamentalist, I think the answer is nope. A fox, on the other hand, might feel that it's ridiculous even to pose the question, or that the word abomination is a social construct exclusively, not having any meaning outside a particular cultural context. I disagree. I think there are abominations out there. That just doesn't happen to be one of them. And I've given you an example already. Honor killing is an abomination. A person that thinks there is no such thing as objective moral truth kind of has to do some fancy footwork when they're confronted with phenomena that they despise. On the one hand, we value diversity. We want to celebrate and raise up marginalized groups. We want to promote the well-being of, in particular, females. But on the other hand, we don't want to be cultural imperialists. We don't want to enforce our culturally contingent values on people from other traditions that think differently from us. And if you really, really believe there are no right or wrong answers in morality, it seems to me you have to conclude that people who uphold the practice of honor killing are absolutely on a level playing field with people who condemn it. You can say, we really wish they wouldn't do that, but you can't ringingly affirm, they are wrong. But they are wrong. And if I were the queen of the universe, I would stop them. Gently, if possible, but I would stop them. Now, as a thought experiment, I'm going to imagine that I was born and educated in a traditional society where honor killing is the accepted norm. I'm a somewhat passive person. I'm not an incredibly morally confident person. And I'm a natural loyalist, sort of the opposite of a rebel, somebody that has strong tendencies toward conformity. Otherwise, why would I care so much what my 10th grade textbook said? So I can imagine that this other alternate reality Jean might go along with her own community on this issue. And I'm imagining that she's identical to me in her basic emotional makeup and mental acuity, even though she hasn't had the luxurious education I've had. And so if she and I were to sit down and debate the subject, it would probably be a pretty tough debate. But all along, I would know that I was right. You know that I'm right about this. I don't necessarily despise alternate reality Jean for getting it wrong. She didn't choose where she was born or how she was raised. I don't have to consider her inferior to me. I don't have to condemn every aspect of her culture. Probably if I knew her culture as well as she does, there would be things that I'd agree. Your way is better than ours. All I'm saying is she's wrong about this question, even though, as stipulated by thought experiment, she is me. If I were a fox, I would have no rational way to adjudicate between the two versions of Jean. It would probably take hours for the two of us to fully explain our value systems to each other. With somebody coming from such a different mindset, I would have to get very deep into my most basic premises and my most complicated conclusions about things like human rights, individual autonomy, the social status of women and girls, ownership of one's own body, sexual morality, the extent to which other people ought to influence you, and why the existence or non-existence of God is irrelevant to the issue, which is the subject for another sermon, but not today. And I hope that by the end of that conversation, I would be able to convince alternate Jean. But even if I couldn't, I would still be right. Now, even though I am not a fox, I admire certain foxes very much, in particular those who hold virtues that I wish all hedgehogs would emulate. I think that we should all be skeptical, and that we should be willing to apply our skepticism to ourselves, our own feelings and thoughts, not just other people's. We should be epistemologically modest, prepared to reevaluate our views. We should be willing to embrace complexity and nuance. And we should be willing to entertain ideas that are foreign to our own traditions, cultural, educational, and otherwise. I don't automatically feel kinship with people just because they agree with me that there's such a thing as right and wrong. In particular, if the one big thing that some hedgehog knows is, for instance, a few phrases plucked out of an ancient scripture and interpreted in some kind of arbitrary way, that's not somebody I want to spend a lot of time in conversation with. Or, for another example, and this is not uncommon, if a hedgehog thinks that their own strong feelings or intuitions or instincts are a proof in themselves of correctness just because they are so strongly felt, I have a problem with that too. Instincts can lead you astray. There's a bird, I forget the name. It builds kind of a sloppy nest among dark-colored rocks and lays a white speckled egg. And it knows to sit on the egg rather than one of the rocks because it's programmed to look for the rounder, whiter, speckled thing. But if a researcher sneaks in and puts a soccer ball out among the rocks, the bird will ignore its actual egg and try to hatch the ball instead. I mean, just look at that. What could be bigger, rounder, whiter, or more speckledy? Honey, this is the place to sit. Okay, we might have stuff in us that's like that bird. I think that we have instincts programmed into us that lead us toward moral feeling. Primate research, and I'm not going to get deeply into this, maybe on another sermon, shows that we have deep-seated drives toward cooperation and fairness. But that doesn't mean that all of our instincts point us in the same correct direction. We might have stuff in us that's like that bird that leads us away from moral accuracy instead of towards it, that we might not even be aware that we have, like a little whisper, deep in your reptile brain. Like, people like me are the ones that really count. People outside my group are inferior. They don't really deserve everything my people deserve. My people are civilized. Those people are more like animals. They're dangerous and dirty. You can't trust them. Our customs are righteous and good. They practice abominations. Or how about this one? If somebody is smaller and weaker than me, somebody lower ranking on the social scale, they should do what I tell them without arguing. Predispositions like that really might be part of the standard human equipment, right alongside those instincts that prompt us to cooperation and fairness. And so we're going to have to train ourselves into some skepticism about our natural reactions. Not to not feel them, but just to check whether they're lining up in support of our best moral judgment, or whether this is one of those times where we have to go against the grain. In a nutshell, there aren't any shortcuts to moral foundation, either from listening to God or from listening to your guts. The only thing that entitles you to feel you can rely on any one particular moral judgment of yours is the whole pattern of every one of your values, every other one, all taken together. So it's going to take 25 years to hammer out your full-fledged lifetime moral code in detail. I'm just going to say two more things relatively quickly without fully explaining them. And one is a point that Dworkin makes, and that's what he calls the radical position that the moral realm is metaphysically independent. Okay? That means that it can't be, and doesn't need to be, grounded in reasoning outside the moral realm. Science, for instance. No amount of studying biology and evolution by itself can give you a reason to be morally certain that women should be treated as well as men are. The only way you're going to get from this is how things actually are to this is how things should be is either by drawing on a moral premise or a previously proved moral conclusion. Dworkin calls this Hume's principle. That doesn't mean you're never going to make use of your scientific knowledge in your moral reasoning. It just means that science isn't the foundation. The other thing is an analogy of my own. Okay, moral reasoning is abstract and self-contained, the same way mathematics is. And there actually has been a parallel foundations crisis in mathematics about a century ago, like the one in moral philosophy. I'm not going to get into detail how that played out, but see, there are mathematical objects that don't have any existence in the material, physical world. Geometric lines and planes, numbers. The number 3 is not out there in the universe. 3 itself is not a thing. Only 3 of something is things. But that doesn't mean, very few people would say that it meant, that you can't say something true about the number 3, or untrue for that matter. So should is not like a unicorn. It's more like the number 3. And interpretive concepts like justice or liberty, they can be thought of as something like circles and lines in geometry. And so what if the real world only approximates circles and lines? Euclidean circles and lines are still mental objects that we can reason about. And the interpretive arguments that we put together about objects of moral reasoning, such as justice and liberty, they can be valid in the same way that mathematical proofs are valid, even though at their very foundation, they do not draw on anything outside mathematics. So I'm planning to organize a reading group for people that would like to work their way through this book with me. I'm going to invite people from the philosophy department on campus and whoever else wants to do it, and maybe work through a chapter a week this fall. It's hard reading, so it's kind of nice to have some help and company with it. And give me your email if you're interested. Thank you very much. This ends Jean's seminar series number 1, Moral Foundations.